Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the most chilling mysteries piece by piece. Today, we dive into the shocking case of a missing 13-year-old girl and the life-saving app that helped bring her home. 13-year-old Savannah Copeland had always been a creature of routine. Every morning, she walked to Brooksville Middle School with her best friend, Lily, and every afternoon, she returned home at precisely 3:45 p.m. She was a responsible and independent girl, the kind who never veered from her usual path. That's why, when 4 p.m. passed with no sign of her, her mother, Grace, started to worry. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Maybe Savannah had stayed late to help a teacher or chat with friends. But when her calls went straight to voicemail and her texts remained unread, unease crept in. By 5 p.m., Grace was pacing the kitchen, glancing out the window every few minutes, hoping to see her daughter strolling up the driveway. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street, and still, Savannah was nowhere to be found. Grace called Lily's mother, hoping for reassurance. Lily answered the phone herself, her voice confused. No, she hadn't seen Savannah since the last bell rang. No, she hadn't mentioned any plans after school. A sharp chill ran down Grace's spine. If Savannah wasn't with Lily, then where was she? She tried to rationalize her fear. Maybe Savannah had gone to the library and lost track of time. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But deep down, she felt something was wrong. Savannah wasn't the type to disappear without telling her. By 6:30 p.m., panic fully set in. Grace grabbed her keys and drove to the school, hoping to find some clue to her daughter's whereabouts. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few teachers heading to their cars. The school's front doors were locked, and the dimly lit hallways inside were eerily still. There was no sign of Savannah. Heart-pounding, she drove through town, retracing the route her daughter usually took home. She stopped at the library, the park, and the nearby convenience store. Nothing. No one had seen Savannah. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. By the time she returned home, it was almost 8 p.m., and desperation had taken hold. She dialed 911, her hands shaking. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to ease her fear as she explained that her daughter had never come home. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived. 2 officers, one young and fresh-faced, the other older and serious, took down every detail Grace could give them. They asked the usual questions. Had Savannah ever run away before? No. Had she been acting strangely? No. Was there any trouble at home? Absolutely not. The officers nodded, taking notes, but Grace could tell they weren't as worried as she was. "It hasn't been 24 hours yet," the older officer said gently. "Most kids show up within a few hours. Maybe she's with a friend." But Grace knew better. Savannah wouldn't do this. She wouldn't put her through this kind of worry. Something was wrong. The officers promised to put out a bolo, be on the lookout, but without evidence of foul play, there wasn't much they could do yet. They encouraged Grace to keep calling her daughter's friends and to check back if anything changed. As they left, Grace sank onto the couch, staring at the front door, willing Savannah to walk through it. The house, usually filled with the sounds of her daughter's laughter, felt empty and cold. A mother knows when something is wrong, and Grace knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager sneaking off. Savannah was missing, and she needed to be found. With every passing hour, fear wrapped itself tighter around Grace's chest. The police had promised they were doing everything they could, but with no concrete leads, she felt helpless. Savannah was out there somewhere, scared, alone, or worse, and Grace couldn't just sit and wait for news. She needed to do something. Then she remembered Life360. Grace had installed the tracking app on Savannah's phone a year ago, mostly for peace of mind. Savannah had protested at first, claiming it was unnecessary, but Grace insisted it was for emergencies only. Now, with her daughter missing, she grabbed her phone with shaking hands and opened the app. Her heart pounded as the map loaded. A small purple dot marked her own location at home, but Savannah's icon wasn't where it should be. Instead of showing her at school or anywhere familiar, her last recorded location was on the outskirts of town near Miller's farm. Confusion clouded Grace's panic. That area was miles away, far from Savannah's usual route home. There were no shops, no houses, just empty farmland and abandoned buildings. Why would she be there? She dialed the police immediately. Detective Laura Martinez, who had been assigned to the case, picked up after 2 rings. Grace's voice was frantic as she explained what she had found, reading off the exact coordinates from the app. Within minutes, officers were dispatched to the location. Grace insisted on going with them, unable to sit at home and wait. The drive felt endless, every second stretching unbearably long. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap, nails digging into her palms as her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. When they finally arrived at Miller's farm, the scene was eerie. The land had once belonged to an old cattle farmer, but after his death, the property had been abandoned. Now the fields were overgrown with weeds, and the barn stood like a rotting skeleton against the night sky. Flashlights cut through the darkness as officers moved carefully through the area. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the brittle grass. Then, someone shouted. An officer held up something small, Savannah's backpack. Grace's stomach dropped. The bag was partially open, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. Inside, they found her school books, a water bottle, and her phone charger. But her phone was missing. The officers pressed forward, searching the barn first. The door creaked open with a long, agonizing groan, revealing the dust-covered remains of what had once been a workspace. A rusted tractor sat in one corner, its tires deflated, cobwebs stretched across its frame. Empty feed bags were scattered across the floor. But there was no sign of Savannah. They expanded the search, moving toward the tree line at the edge of the property. The dogs they had brought along sniffed the air, circling the area in tight patterns. One of them barked sharply, pawing at the ground near an old wooden fence. The jacket. Grace recognized it instantly. It was Savannah's. Terror gripped her throat as she stared at the discarded piece of clothing. This wasn't just a random stop on Savannah's way home. She had been here. Something had happened to her here. But where was she now? The discovery of Savannah's backpack and jacket sent a wave of urgency through the search team. Detective Martinez ordered officers to widen their perimeter, scanning the area for any additional clues. Grace stood frozen, staring at the jacket in the officer's hands, her mind spinning. Savannah had been here, but if she had simply wandered off, why would she leave her things behind? The alternative was too horrifying to dwell on. The officers continued searching as forensic specialists arrived to process the scene. They dusted the backpack for fingerprints, examined the ground for any signs of a struggle, and combed through the overgrown grass for footprints. It wasn't long before they found something else, a trail of disturbed leaves and snapped twigs leading deeper into the woods. It was as if someone had walked or been dragged through the dense underbrush. Grace's stomach twisted. Every new discovery seemed to confirm her worst fears. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. Something had happened to Savannah, and someone had taken her. The team followed the trail cautiously. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the surroundings became. The woods here were thick, untouched for years. The only sounds were the crunching of boots on dry leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. Then, ahead, something unexpected came into view. A small, weathered shack. Barely visible through the trees, It looked old, possibly abandoned, with its wooden walls covered in moss and ivy. The windows were either broken or boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar. The officers approached carefully, weapons drawn. The tension in the air was thick as one of them pushed the door open. Inside, the space was cluttered with discarded food wrappers, empty water bottles, and a makeshift bed made of tattered blankets. It was clear someone had been living here, but what caught everyone's attention was the stack of newspapers piled in the corner. Detective Martinez stepped forward and lifted one of the papers, flipping through its pages. Most of them were about local events, but one headline made her pause. Brooksville Middle School hosts annual spring play. The article was weeks old, and yet it had been carefully clipped and kept separate from the others. Beneath it, they found another one featuring a photo of Savannah and her classmates, smiling in their costumes. A sickening realization settled over the room. Whoever had been living here had been watching Savannah. Grace felt her knees go weak. Someone had been following her daughter, reading about her, keeping track of her life. This wasn't random, this was planned. The forensic team collected the newspapers as evidence, while officers searched the shack for more clues. Among the scattered belongings, they found a rusted hunting knife, a flashlight, and a few articles of old clothing. But there was no sign of Savannah. Then, as one of the officers turned to leave, something on the wall caught his eye. Scratched into the wood, barely visible in the dim light, were 3 words, "I will return." The message sent chills through everyone in the room. Whoever had taken Savannah wasn't done, and if they had left this behind, it meant they planned on coming back. Time was running out. They had to find her before it was too late. The chilling message carved into the shack's wall ignited a new sense of urgency. Whoever had taken Savannah had been staying here, possibly watching the search unfold from a distance. But where had they gone? And more importantly, where was Savannah now? Detective Martinez ordered the search team to spread out, covering the surrounding area in a tight grid formation. Tracking dogs sniffed at the ground, picking up a scent trail that led deeper into the woods. The officers followed, pushing through tangled branches and uneven terrain, moving as quickly as they could without losing the trail. Every second felt like an eternity to Grace. She trailed behind the officers, her heart hammering with every step. The woods seemed endless, the darkness pressing in as the sun sank lower. Savannah was out there somewhere, and they were running out of time. Then, a sudden bark from one of the tracking dogs shattered the tense silence. The handler called out, pointing ahead. The officers rushed forward, flashlights cutting through the dimming light. There, partially hidden by thick brush, was another small structure, an old hunting cabin, long forgotten and covered in ivy. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently with the breeze. It was eerily quiet. No movement, no signs of life. The officers approached with caution, weapons drawn. One of them called out, but there was no response. With a silent nod, one officer took position at the door while another prepared to push it open. In an instant, the door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Against the far wall in the corner of the room sat a figure curled up on the floor. Savannah. Grace's breath caught in her throat. One of the officers rushed forward, kneeling beside the girl. Her wrists were loosely tied with rope, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. She flinched at the sudden movement, her eyes wide with fear, but as the officer spoke to her gently, her expression shifted first to confusion, then to relief. "She's alive," the officer called out. Grace's legs nearly gave out beneath her as she stumbled forward, barely aware of the officers securing the area around them. Savannah looked up, her face pale, her body trembling as her mother wrapped her arms around her, holding her close. The nightmare wasn't over yet. The person who had taken her was still out there. The officers moved swiftly, clearing the rest of the cabin. The back door had been left open, leading into the dense woods beyond. He had escaped, vanishing into the trees just before they arrived. As paramedics checked Savannah over, the officers radioed for backup, launching a manhunt through the forest. Through choked sobs, Savannah managed to whisper what had happened. A man had lured her by pretending he needed help finding his lost dog. Before she realized what was happening, he had grabbed her, covering her mouth before dragging her away. She had been too terrified to fight back. But now she was safe. And they were going to find the man who had done this. The relief of finding Savannah alive was overwhelming, but the search was far from over. The man who had taken her was still out there, slipping deeper into the woods under the cover of darkness. Officers spread out in pursuit, their flashlights bouncing through the trees as the sound of snapping branches echoed in the distance. Savannah clung to Grace, shaking from exhaustion and fear. Paramedics wrapped her in a blanket, checking for injuries. Aside from bruises and dehydration, she was unharmed, but the terror in her wide eyes was unmistakable. Grace held her daughter tightly, whispering reassurances as tears streamed down her face. Detective Martinez stayed behind with Savannah while the other officers combed the forest. The man they were looking for had a head start, but he had left behind enough evidence to ensure he wouldn't be free for long. The fingerprints on Savannah's backpack, the food wrappers in the shack, the chilling words scratched into the wall, everything pointed to a single suspect. Jacob Riley. His name sent a shudder through the search team. Riley had a troubled past, with a history of mental illness and a record of previous offenses. None as serious as kidnapping, but enough to paint a disturbing picture. After serving time for breaking into a family's home years ago, he had disappeared, living off the grid in abandoned buildings and the woods surrounding Brooksville. For years, no one had paid much attention to him, but now he was the most wanted man in town. Hours passed as officers pursued him through the dense forest. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights sweeping the treetops. The dogs picked up his scent near a creek bed, leading officers toward a rocky incline where they finally spotted movement, a shadow darting between the trees. "Stop hands where we can see them." A burst of commotion followed, officers shouting, branches cracking, a brief struggle, and then silence. Jacob Riley was in custody. Back at the scene, Detective Martinez received the call. She turned to Grace and Savannah, nodding. "We got him." Grace exhaled sharply, a sob of relief escaping her lips. Savannah's grip on her mother tightened, her body finally releasing the tension that had held her captive for the past 2 days. It was over. Riley was taken into custody and charged with kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and a list of other offenses. At his trial, the evidence against him was undeniable. Savannah bravely testified, describing how he had tricked her into following him and how he had kept her locked away in the hunting cabin, talking to himself and scribbling strange notes on the walls. His obsession with children, particularly Savannah, had been fueled by delusions, ones that had spiraled dangerously out of control. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding him guilty. Due to his history of mental illness, he was sentenced to life in a high-security psychiatric facility. He would never walk free again. In the months that followed, Savannah slowly began to heal. She still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden noises, but she was surrounded by love and support. Grace became an advocate for child safety, urging parents to use tracking apps like Life360 and teaching children how to recognize dangerous situations. The town of Brooksville would never forget what had happened, but Savannah's survival became a beacon of hope, a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, justice could prevail.